The afternoon of April 9th, 1945, found Margaret Weber standing at the window of her small farmhouse near the Bavarian town of Dachau, watching columns of American tanks roll past on the muddy country road. Her hands trembled as she held the lace curtain aside, not from the vibration of the Sherman tanks, but from the terror that had been building in her chest for weeks as Allied forces approached her village. At 34, Margaret was a widow whose husband Klaus had been killed fighting on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier, leaving her to raise their 2 children, 8-year-old Hans and 6-year-old Greta, in a Germany that was collapsing around them. But her fear wasn't simply about the approaching end of the war or the uncertainty of occupation. Her terror was far more specific and personal. "Mama," whispered little Greta, tugging at her mother's worn wool skirt. "Why are you crying? Are the American soldiers going to hurt us?" Margaret knelt down to embrace her daughter, trying to hide the depth of her anxiety from children who had already experienced too much fear during their short lives. How could she explain to a 6-year-old that their family faced particular danger because of choices made long before the children were old enough to understand politics or war? "I don't know, Liebling," Margarete whispered, using the German endearment that meant darling. "But we must be very careful and very brave no matter what happens." The source of Margaret's terror lay in a secret that had haunted her for 3 years, a secret that could cost her children their lives if discovered by either retreating German forces or advancing Allied troops. In 1942, when Nazi authorities had begun systematically murdering disabled individuals in the so-called euthanasia program, Margaret had hidden her mentally disabled brother Friedrich in her farmhouse cellar, providing him with food, medical care, and protection from SS units that were conducting door-to-door searches for undesirable individuals. Friedrich Weber had been born with what doctors now called Down syndrome, but which Nazi ideology classified as life unworthy of life. When the Transport Ministry had arrived at the regional institution where Friedrich lived to collect disabled residents for relocation, Margarete had made a desperate choice that saved her brother's life, but marked her family as enemies of the Nazi state. For 3 years, she had maintained the fiction that Friedrich had died of natural causes, producing forged death certificates and conducting an elaborate deception that required the cooperation of Dr. Heinrich Müller, the village physician who had been secretly treating Friedrich despite the enormous legal risks. Their conspiracy had saved one man's life, but created a web of evidence that could be used against them by anyone seeking revenge. Now, as American forces occupied the region and Nazi collaborators faced uncertain fates, Margarete feared that neighbors who knew her secret might use it to deflect attention from their own wartime activities. In a community where survival often depended on finding scapegoats, a woman who had defied Nazi racial policies might become a convenient target for those seeking to prove their own innocence. "Hans," she called to her son, who was playing with wooden soldiers near the kitchen stove. "Come help me move some things to the cellar. We need to make sure Uncle Friedrich has everything he needs." 8-year-old Hans Weber had grown up knowing that his uncle lived in hiding beneath their house, but he didn't fully understand why such secrecy was necessary or what consequences discovery might bring. The boy had been taught to speak quietly when in the cellar, and never to mention Uncle Friedrich to anyone outside the family, but he accepted these restrictions as normal parts of childhood during wartime. As Margaret and Hans descended into the cellar with food and clean clothing for Friedrich, she tried to explain the dangerous situation they now faced without terrifying the children more than necessary. "Uncle Friedrich must stay hidden for a few more days," she told Hans, while their disabled relatives smiled and accepted the bread and milk they had brought. "There are people who might try to hurt him or hurt us for helping him. We must be very careful until we know it's safe." Hans nodded solemnly, understanding that his family's situation was more dangerous than the general chaos of military occupation. At 8 years old, he had already learned to keep secrets and recognize when adults were frightened, skills that no child should need, but that wartime had made essential for survival. Friedrich Weber, now 31 years old, had the mental capacity of a young child despite his adult body. He couldn't fully understand the political situation that made his existence dangerous, but he could sense his sister's fear and the increased tension in their household routine. "Margarete," he said, in the simple vocabulary that comprised his limited speech. "Soldiers coming, Friedrich stay hidden?" "Yes, Friedrich. Margaret replied gently, smoothing her brother's graying hair. You stay hidden until I tell you it's safe, just like always. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles stopping outside their farmhouse. Through the small cellar window, Margaret could see American soldiers dismounting from a jeep and preparing to search the property, a routine procedure for occupying forces, but one that could expose secrets that had been protected for 3 years. Hans, Margaret whispered urgently, take your sister upstairs and stay in the kitchen. Be polite to the soldiers, but don't volunteer any information. If they ask about other people in the house, just say it's you, me, and Greta. As Hans disappeared up the cellar stairs, Margaret faced the moment she had been dreading since American forces entered the region. Discovery of Friedrich would expose her as someone who had systematically defied Nazi policies, but it might also mark her as a resistance fighter who deserved protection rather than punishment. The uncertainty was agonizing. The knock on her front door was firm but not aggressive, professional military courtesy rather than hostile invasion. Margaret climbed the stairs from the cellar, checked that the hidden entrance was properly concealed, and opened the door to face 3 American soldiers whose expressions suggested routine inspection rather than specific suspicion. Guten Tag, said the soldier who appeared to be in charge, attempting German pronunciation of good day. I am Sergeant Robert Murphy, United States Army. We are conducting security checks of all residences in this area. Margarete nodded nervously, switching to the English she had learned during better times when her husband had worked for an international shipping company. Good afternoon, Sergeant. I am Margaret Weber. These are my children, Hans and Greta. Sergeant Murphy's surprise at her English capability was evident, but it also seemed to put him at ease. The ability to communicate directly without interpreters often made such encounters less tense for both occupying forces and German civilians. Mrs. Weber, Murphy said politely, we need to search your house for weapons, enemy personnel, or Nazi party materials. This is standard procedure for all buildings in the area. Margaret's heart raced as she considered the implications of a thorough search that might discover Friedrich's hiding place or evidence of the conspiracy that had protected him. Her children's safety now depended on her ability to navigate questions that could expose secrets that had been carefully guarded for 3 years. Of course, Sergeant, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Please search whatever you need to search. We have nothing to hide. The lie came easily, but it carried enormous weight. Everything they had done for 3 years had been about hiding, and discovery now could mean not just exposure of their secret, but retaliation from German neighbors who might use their wartime resistance activities as evidence of disloyalty to justify their own collaboration with Nazi authorities. As the American soldiers began their systematic search of the farmhouse, Margareta realized that her family's fate now rested in the hands of enemies who might become either protectors or instruments of the justice she feared was coming for those who had dared to choose humanity over ideology during the darkest years of human history. 20 minutes into their systematic search of the Weber farmhouse, Private Johnny Rodriguez noticed something that made him pause near the kitchen's stone floor. The young soldier from New Mexico had developed a keen eye for concealed spaces during months of house-to-house searches across Germany, and the subtle difference in sound when he walked across one section of floor suggested a hollow space beneath. Sarge, Rodriguez called to Sergeant Murphy, keeping his voice low to avoid alarming the German family. I think there's something under this floor. Sounds like there might be a cellar or hidden room. Margaret felt her blood turn to ice as she watched the American soldiers examine the floor near her kitchen table. The concealed entrance to Friedrich's hiding place was expertly camouflaged, but experienced soldiers knew what to look for when searching for weapons caches or hidden personnel. Mrs. Weber, Sergeant Murphy said carefully, studying Margaret's face for signs of deception, is there a cellar beneath this floor? We need to examine all spaces in the building. Margaret's mind raced as she considered her options. Lying to occupying forces was dangerous and would make any eventual discovery appear more suspicious, but revealing Friedrich's presence might expose him to violence from soldiers who had been trained to view Germans as enemies or Nazi sympathizers. Yes, she said quietly, making a decision that would determine her family's fate. There is a cellar, but please, there is someone down there who has been hiding. Someone who needed protection from the Nazis. The admission hung in the air like a confession that could lead either to understanding or to disaster. Hans and Greta moved closer to their mother, sensing the gravity of the moment, even if they couldn't fully comprehend its implications. Sergeant Murphy exchanged glances with his men, understanding that they were about to discover either German resistance activities or evidence of war crimes. Their training had prepared them for both possibilities, but the presence of young children complicated any situation that might require aggressive action. "Who is hiding in the cellar?" Murphy asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon while maintaining a non-threatening posture. "German soldiers, Nazi officials." "My brother," Margarete replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "My disabled brother. The Nazis wanted to kill him because they said his life was not worth living. I have been hiding him for 3 years. The explanation challenged every assumption the American soldiers had formed about German civilian compliance with Nazi policies. Instead of discovering enemy personnel or weapons, they were apparently uncovering evidence of humanitarian resistance that had risked everything to protect vulnerable individuals. Private Rodriguez, whose own family had experienced discrimination in New Mexico, understood something about protecting relatives from government persecution. "Ma'am," he said gently, "we're not here to hurt disabled people. Can you show us where your brother is hiding?" Margaret led the soldiers to the concealed entrance, her hands shaking as she moved aside the false floorboards that had protected Friedrich for 3 years. The hiding space was small but well ventilated, furnished with a bed, chair, and shelves containing books and personal possessions that suggested long-term occupancy. Friedrich Weber looked up at the American soldiers with the curious but unafraid expression of someone whose intellectual disability protected him from understanding the danger of his situation. He smiled at the strangers, offering a tentative wave that demonstrated the innocent friendliness that had made his persecution by Nazi authorities particularly cruel. "Hello," Friedrich said in simple English he had learned from his sister. "I am Friedrich. Are you friends?" The sight of a disabled man greeting enemy soldiers with childlike trust created an emotional impact that none of the Americans had expected. This was not the defiant Nazi fanatic or dangerous enemy combatant they had been trained to apprehend, but a vulnerable human being who had survived only through his family's courage and sacrifice. Sergeant Murphy knelt down to Friedrich's level, speaking slowly and gently in the tone he used with his own young nephew back in Ohio. "Yes, Friedrich, we are friends. You don't need to hide anymore. You're safe now." The promise of safety was both heartfelt and potentially premature. While American forces had no intention of harming disabled individuals, the broader question of how to protect German civilians who had resisted Nazi policies remained complex and dangerous. "Mrs. Weber," Murphy said, turning back to Margaret with growing respect for her courage, "you saved your brother's life by hiding him. That took remarkable bravery." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she realized that the American soldiers were not going to arrest or harm her family. But her relief was tempered by awareness that other dangers remained from German neighbors who might view her wartime activities as betrayal or collaboration with enemies. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "there are people in the village who know what I did. Some of them worked with the Nazis and might try to make trouble for my family now that the war is ending. They might say I was a traitor for helping my brother instead of following Nazi orders." The warning revealed the complex dynamics of post-war German communities, where survival often depended on deflecting blame onto convenient scapegoats. Margaret's humanitarian resistance activities made her vulnerable to accusations from neighbors seeking to hide their own collaboration with Nazi authorities. Murphy understood immediately that Margaret's family faced danger not from American occupation forces, but from German civilians who might use her resistance activities as evidence of their own loyalty to the former regime. The irony was that someone who had risked everything to save lives might now face retribution for choosing humanity over ideology. "Who might try to hurt you?" Murphy asked, his military training kicking in as he assessed potential threats to civilians under American protection. Margaret hesitated, understanding that naming names might create additional conflicts in a community already struggling with the chaos of occupation and regime change. But her children's safety required honest assessment of the dangers they faced. "Heinrich Koller was the local Nazi party leader," she said quietly. "He knows about Friedrich because he helped organize the searches for disabled people. If he tells the Americans that I defied Nazi orders, He might hope to prove his own value as an informant. The political calculation was sophisticated and entirely plausible. Former Nazi officials who could provide information about resistance activities might hope to secure better treatment from occupying forces, even if it meant destroying families who had demonstrated remarkable courage. Hans and Greta had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense attention that children develop when they sense their family's safety is at stake. Neither fully understood the political complexities involved, but both recognized that their mother was afraid and that the American soldiers seemed to be trying to help rather than harm them. "Sergeant Murphy," Hans said in careful English, using the formal address his mother had taught him, "will you protect Uncle Friedrich? Mama says bad people want to hurt him." The 8-year-old's direct question forced Murphy to confront the reality that protecting vulnerable German civilians might require ongoing American involvement in local community conflicts. His orders covered military occupation duties, but they hadn't prepared him for situations where former resistance fighters needed protection from their own neighbors. "Yes, Hans," Murphy replied, making a commitment that exceeded his official authority but reflected his understanding of military honor and humanitarian obligation. "We will make sure your uncle and your family are safe." The promise would require Murphy and his men to remain at the Weber farmhouse longer than standard inspection procedures dictated, but it also reflected American values about protecting vulnerable individuals from persecution based on disability or political revenge. As evening approached and Murphy prepared to radio his superiors about the situation, he realized that the Weber family's case illustrated the complex moral landscape that American forces would need to navigate throughout the occupation period. Simple categories of enemy and ally were inadequate for situations where courage and humanity had motivated resistance to Nazi policies at enormous personal risk. The German woman who had predicted retaliation for her wartime choices was discovering that American soldiers were willing to protect her children not just from immediate danger, but from the long-term consequences of having chosen compassion over compliance with an evil regime. As darkness fell over the Bavarian countryside on April 9, 1945, Sergeant Murphy made a decision that would define his understanding of American responsibilities during the occupation of Germany. Rather than completing their search and moving on to the next house, he and his men would remain at the Weber farmhouse to provide protection against the retaliation that Margaret feared from her German neighbors. "Rodriguez," Murphy instructed his radio man, "contact headquarters and inform them that we're establishing a temporary observation post at this location. Tell them we've discovered a German family that provided assistance to persecuted individuals and may face reprisals from former Nazi collaborators." The radio message would require careful explanation to military commanders who were focused on broader strategic objectives rather than individual cases of humanitarian protection. But Murphy understood that American values demanded protection for people who had risked everything to save innocent lives during the Nazi regime. Private Eddie Sullivan, the third member of Murphy's squad, was assigned to establish a watch position that would provide early warning of any approach to the farmhouse. The 19-year-old from Boston had seen enough of war to understand that combat could end, but danger could continue for civilians caught between competing factions during occupation periods. "Sarge," Sullivan observed while setting up his position near the farmhouse's front window, "if these Nazi guys are really planning something against this family, they'll probably wait until they think we've moved on. They're not going to start trouble while American soldiers are obviously present." Murphy nodded, recognizing the tactical logic that would govern any potential retaliation against the Weber family. Former Nazi officials would need to eliminate witnesses or evidence of their own wartime activities, but they would wait for opportunities that didn't involve direct confrontation with occupying forces. Margaret had prepared a simple evening meal for her unexpected protectors, using precious remaining supplies to demonstrate gratitude for their intervention on her family's behalf. The shared meal created an informal atmosphere that allowed for conversations that transcended the normal boundaries between occupying forces and German civilians. "Mrs. Weber," Murphy asked while sampling the potato soup that Margaret had prepared, "how long did you manage to keep your brother hidden? 3 years seems like an incredibly long time to maintain such a dangerous secret." Margarete smiled sadly as she watched Friedrich eat his dinner with the careful attention he gave to all simple pleasures. It required help from Dr. Müller in the village, and we had to create false records showing that Friedrich had died of pneumonia in 1942. Every day was frightening, but what choice did we have? The practical details of their 3-year deception revealed the enormous courage and planning required to protect vulnerable individuals from Nazi persecution. Margaret's resistance activities had been motivated by family loyalty, but they had required the same organizational skills and personal bravery that characterized more formally recognized resistance movements. Rodriguez, whose grandmother had hidden undocumented relatives in New Mexico during immigration crackdowns, understood something about the stress of long-term concealment. "Mom, keeping someone hidden for 3 years, that must have been incredibly difficult. How did you manage the psychological pressure?" "We took it one day at a time," Margaret replied quietly. "Friedrich doesn't understand politics or danger, so we had to remain calm for his sake. Children can sense when adults are frightened, and we didn't want to traumatize him more than necessary." Hans and Greta had been assigned to help entertain Friedrich during the evening, playing simple card games and showing him picture books that provided mental stimulation during his long confinement. The children's natural acceptance of their uncle's disability demonstrated family values that had motivated Margaret's resistance to Nazi policies. "Uncle Friedrich," Hans said while dealing cards for a game of memory, "you don't have to stay in the cellar anymore. The American soldiers say you're safe now." Friedrich's face lit up with joy at the prospect of ending his 3-year confinement. Friedrich can go outside, see the sky, see the chickens, the simple pleasures that Friedrich anticipated. Sunlight, fresh air, and freedom of movement highlighted the cruelty of policies that had targeted disabled individuals for elimination. His innocent excitement about basic human experiences made his persecution seem particularly evil. As the evening progressed, Murphy and his men learned more about the Weber family's wartime experiences and the community dynamics that now threatened their safety. Margaret's detailed knowledge of local Nazi collaborators provided valuable intelligence about potential security threats during the occupation period. "Heinrich Koller owns the large farm about 2 kilometers east of here," Margarete explained while pointing to locations on a hand-drawn map. He was enthusiastic about Nazi policies and helped organize the roundups of disabled people and Jewish families. If he feels threatened by American investigations, he might try to eliminate witnesses to his activities. The intelligence was sobering, revealing that American forces might need to provide protection not just from organized military resistance, but from individuals seeking to destroy evidence of their war crimes. The occupation would require careful attention to local dynamics that could affect vulnerable civilians. Sullivan had taken the first watch shift, positioning himself where he could observe approaches to the farmhouse while remaining concealed from potential threats. His training in night observation and defensive positions was proving valuable for protecting civilians rather than engaging enemy combatants. "Movement on the eastern approach," Sullivan reported quietly over the radio at approximately 22 to 30 hours. 3 or 4 individuals moving carefully through the fields. "They're trying to stay concealed, but I can track them by moonlight." Murphy immediately alerted his men and moved to positions that would allow them to intercept any threat to the Weber family without exposing the children to unnecessary danger. The situation required tactical awareness combined with sensitivity to the family they were protecting. "Mrs. Weber," Murphy whispered, "take your children and Friedrich to the back bedroom and stay away from the windows. We're going to investigate some movement outside." Margaret quickly gathered her family, understanding that the retaliation she had feared might be beginning. Her children's safety now depended on American soldiers who had volunteered to protect a German family against threats from their own neighbors. The approaching figures proved to be Heinrich Koller and 2 associates, all armed with hunting rifles and moving with the careful stealth of men planning violent action under cover of darkness. Their intent was clearly hostile, and their timing suggested advanced planning rather than spontaneous anger. "This is Sergeant Murphy, United States Army," Murphy called out in German as the 3 men approached the farmhouse. "You are entering a secured area. State your business or withdraw immediately." Koller's response was a combination of bravado and desperation, revealing his awareness that American occupation threatened his ability to eliminate evidence of his wartime activities. "We are German citizens seeking to apprehend a traitor who collaborated with enemies of the German people." "The only traitor here is you, Koller," Murphy replied firmly. demonstrating knowledge of the man's background that made further deception pointless. Drop your weapons and return to your homes. This family is under American protection. The confrontation lasted only minutes, but it represented a crucial test of American commitment to protecting vulnerable civilians during the occupation period. Collar and his associates withdrew when faced with determined American opposition, but their attempt confirmed that Margaret's fears of retaliation had been entirely justified. "It's over," Murphy announced as he returned to the farmhouse where the Weber family waited anxiously for news. "They won't be back tonight, and we'll make sure they understand that any further threats will result in their arrest." Margaret's relief was evident as she thanked the American soldiers who had protected her family from the consequences of having chosen humanity over ideology during the Nazi years. Her children's safety had been secured by enemies who had become protectors through their commitment to justice and human dignity. The night that had begun with fear of retaliation ended with the understanding that American occupation would provide protection for those who had resisted Nazi persecution, even when such protection required intervention in complex local conflicts between German civilians. The second night at the Weber farmhouse passed more quietly than the first, but Sergeant Murphy and his men maintained their vigilance while developing a longer-term strategy for protecting the family from ongoing threats. Radio communications with headquarters had brought both support for their protective mission and orders to document the humanitarian resistance activities they had discovered. "Captain Williams wants a full report on the Weber family's resistance activities," Rodriguez informed Murphy while monitoring radio traffic from division headquarters. "Intelligence is particularly interested in their network of local supporters and their methods for avoiding Nazi detection." The request reflected growing American interest in identifying German civilians who had opposed Nazi policies, both for their intelligence value and as potential allies during the Reconstruction period. Margaret's 3-year successful concealment of her disabled brother represented exactly the kind of moral courage that American authorities hoped to find and support. Dr. Heinrich Müller arrived at the farmhouse shortly after dawn, having heard through village networks that American soldiers were protecting the Weber family. The elderly physician carried his medical bag and a worn expression that reflected 3 years of participating in dangerous humanitarian conspiracy. "I came to check on Friedrich," Dr. Müller explained to Sergeant Murphy in careful English. "I have been his physician throughout his time in hiding, providing medical care despite the legal risks." Murphy understood immediately that Dr. Müller was another member of the resistance network that had protected Friedrich Weber and potentially other persecuted individuals. The doctor's willingness to reveal himself suggested both trust in American protection and relief that the dangerous years of concealment were finally ending. "Doctor," Murphy said respectfully, "your service to this family was heroic. We want to document what you did so that American authorities understand who were the real heroes during the Nazi period." Dr. Müller's medical examination of Friedrich revealed the positive health outcomes that had resulted from 3 years of careful family care, despite extremely difficult circumstances. The disabled man's physical condition was actually better than many Germans who had suffered from wartime malnutrition and stress. "Friedrich has been well cared for," Dr. Müller reported to Murphy while completing his examination. His sister provided excellent nursing care, proper nutrition from their limited supplies, and the emotional support necessary for someone with his cognitive challenges. The medical assessment provided additional evidence of Margaret's extraordinary dedication to her brother's welfare, reinforcing American respect for her humanitarian resistance activities. Her care had exceeded what many disabled individuals received in institutional settings, even during peacetime. Private Sullivan had established morning watch positions that provided security while allowing the Weber family to resume some normal activities after 2 days of intensive protection. Hans and Greta were able to play outside under American supervision, while Friedrich experienced his first sunlight in 3 years. "Look, Uncle Friedrich," Greta called excitedly as her uncle emerged from the farmhouse into brilliant morning sunshine. "The chickens remember you. They're coming to say hello." Friedrich's joy at simple interactions with farm animals was deeply moving for the American soldiers, who recognized that his intellectual disability had made him particularly vulnerable to Nazi persecution, but also particularly innocent of any political implications surrounding his situation. Margaret had been preparing testimony about her resistance activities for American intelligence officers who were scheduled to arrive later that day. Her detailed records of the conspiracy that had protected Friedrich would provide valuable insights into German civilian resistance capabilities and moral attitudes during the Nazi period. "I kept careful records of everything we did," Margarete explained to Murphy while organizing 3 years of documentation. "Ration cards, medical certificates, correspondence with Dr. Müller. I thought someday we might need to prove that Friedrich was still alive and that we had cared for him properly." The meticulous documentation reflected both practical necessity and deep love for her brother, but it also provided historical evidence that would help American authorities understand the scope and sophistication of humanitarian resistance activities during the Nazi years. Captain James Williams arrived from division headquarters at midday, accompanied by intelligence officers who were tasked with evaluating the Weber family's case and determining appropriate long-term protection measures. His presence indicated that higher military authorities took seriously the threats against humanitarian resistance figures. "Mrs. Weber," Captain Williams said formally after reviewing Murphy's reports, "your family's actions during the Nazi period represent the kind of moral courage that America hopes to support during the reconstruction of Germany." The official recognition was both validating and protective, establishing American military commitment to defending those who had resisted Nazi persecution. Margaret's status would now be documented in official records that would provide long-term security against retaliation. Intelligence interviews with Margaret and Dr. Müller revealed extensive networks of German civilians who had provided assistance to persecuted individuals, suggesting that resistance to Nazi policies had been more widespread than previously documented. Their testimonies would influence American understanding of German society and occupation policies. "We estimate that perhaps 20 families in this region provided some form of assistance to persecuted individuals," Dr. Müller reported to the intelligence officers. "Most were small-scale efforts, hiding someone for a few days, providing false papers, or sharing food rations. But collectively, they saved many lives." The intelligence was strategically valuable for identifying potential allies during the occupation period, but it also provided hope that German society retained moral foundations that could support democratic reconstruction. Individual acts of courage had preserved humanitarian values even during the darkest years of Nazi rule. As afternoon approached and American protection became clearly established, other villagers began arriving at the Weber farmhouse to seek similar assistance or to provide additional testimony about resistance activities. The farmhouse was evolving into an informal center for documenting humanitarian resistance throughout the region. "These people represent the Germany we want to work with during Reconstruction," Captain Williams observed to Murphy while watching German civilians provide detailed accounts of their wartime resistance activities. They proved that Nazi ideology never completely conquered the German people's capacity for moral choice. The assessment reflected American hopes for finding German partners who could help rebuild their nation on democratic foundations. Individuals who had risked everything to protect innocent lives during the Nazi years were exactly the allies that American occupation authorities needed for successful reconstruction efforts. Hans and Greta had adapted to their new status as protected persons with the resilience that children display during rapidly changing circumstances. Their play now included American soldiers as protective figures rather than threatening enemies, demonstrating how quickly children could adjust to improved security conditions. "Sergeant Murphy," Hans said during an afternoon conversation, "will you stay here until we're safe? Mama says some bad people might still try to hurt Uncle Friedrich." Murphy knelt down to the boy's level, understanding that his answer would shape a child's understanding of American reliability and commitment to protecting vulnerable people. "Hans, we'll make sure your family is safe. American soldiers keep their promises to protect good people." The commitment reflected both personal integrity and institutional values that would guide American occupation policies throughout the post-war period. Protection of humanitarian resistance figures became a priority that demonstrated American commitment to justice and human dignity. As evening approached and permanent security arrangements were finalized, Margareta faced the reality that her 3 years of fearful concealment were finally ending. American protection had transformed her family's situation from dangerous isolation to secure integration with occupation authorities who valued their resistance activities. "I never imagined that enemy soldiers would become our protectors," Margaret confided to Murphy during their final conversation. "You have shown us that America truly values people who choose to do what is right, even when it is dangerous." Murphy smiled, understanding that the Weber family's experience would influence their attitudes toward America and democracy for generations to come. "Mrs. Weber, you protected your brother when it was dangerous to do so. Now it's our honor to protect your family." The exchange represented more than military courtesy. It reflected mutual recognition of shared values that transcended national boundaries and demonstrated that moral courage could create bonds between former enemies. The German woman who had predicted retaliation had instead found protection from soldiers who recognized heroism, regardless of nationality. Friedrich Weber's emergence from 3 years of hiding symbolized both the end of Nazi persecution and the beginning of American commitment to protecting vulnerable individuals during the Reconstruction period. His innocent joy at freedom represented hope that humanitarian values could survive even the darkest periods of human history. As Sergeant Murphy and his men prepared to move on to other duties, they carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in something larger than military occupation. They had helped preserve the lives and dignity of people whose courage during the Nazi years represented the best of human nature. The protection they had provided would influence American occupation policies and demonstrate that former enemies could become allies through shared commitment to justice and human dignity. The 2 Knights of Protection had established precedents that would guide American treatment of humanitarian resistance figures throughout the post-war period, proving that moral courage deserved recognition and protection regardless of the nationality of those who had displayed it. If this powerful story of moral courage protected across enemy lines moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share these incredible stories that prove humanity and heroism know no nationality. We're passionate about uncovering these forgotten moments where people chose to do what was right despite enormous personal risk, and how former enemies recognized and protected that courage. These stories remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual choices to protect the vulnerable can inspire others to choose justice over convenience. What struck you most about this transformation from fear to protection? Margaret's 3-year secret resistance against Nazi policies, the American soldiers' immediate decision to protect rather than judge, or perhaps the recognition that true heroism lies in everyday choices to help those who cannot protect themselves? And here's something profound to consider. In our own time, when we witness injustice or persecution, what can we learn from people who chose to act with courage despite the personal cost? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories of wartime heroism inspire you and what lessons they might hold for standing up for the vulnerable in our own communities today.